The prison hung in the darkness of space like a forgotten relic. It orbited a dying star, its metal walls scarred by years of neglect and harsh conditions. Inside, Ethan Cole sat on the cold floor of his cell, staring at the faint glow of the energy barrier that kept him trapped. His brown hair was messy, and his face carried the shadow of a man who had seen too much. He clenched his fists as he thought about how unfair it all was. Smuggling wasn't even his idea. He'd been set up, but no one cared about the truth here. Across the corridor, Cale stood tall, his shimmering scales reflecting the dim light. The alien guard's sharp eyes scanned the area, always alert. To Ethan, Cale was just another cog in the machine, someone who didn't care about justice or fairness. Cale saw Ethan as reckless and dangerous, a troublemaker who deserved to be locked away. They had exchanged glares and harsh words since Ethan arrived, but now, with the chaos unfolding around them, their mutual hatred would be tested. It started with a low rumble, a vibration that ran through the entire station. At first, Ethan thought it was just another routine maintenance check. Those were common, though they often left parts of the prison without power for hours. But this time, something felt different. The lights flickered violently, and then came the deafening sound of an explosion. Ethan jumped to his feet, pressing himself against the barrier of his cell to see what was happening outside. Cale reacted instantly, moving toward the source of the commotion. His communicator crackled with urgent voices, but the signal was weak and broken. "Asteroid storm!" someone shouted before the transmission cut off completely. Another explosion rocked the station, sending chunks of debris flying down the corridor. Gravity fluctuated wildly, pulling people off their feet and throwing objects into the air. Panic spread like wildfire among the prisoners, who began shouting and banging on their cell doors, demanding to be released. Ethan watched as Cale fought to maintain order, barking commands and firing warning shots with his weapon. But the situation was spiraling out of control. A section of the ceiling collapsed nearby, crushing several cells and killing those inside. Ethan's heart raced as he realized how close he was to meeting the same fate. He pounded on the barrier of his cell, yelling at Cale to let him out. "You can't leave me here," he screamed, but Cale ignored him, focused on keeping the remaining prisoners contained. Then came the worst part. A massive asteroid slammed into the outer hull, tearing a gaping hole in the station. Air rushed out into the vacuum of space, dragging everything and everyone nearby with it. Ethan braced himself against the wall of his cell, watching in horror as bodies and debris were sucked out into the void. The force of the impact sealed off part of the corridor, trapping Cale and Ethan in a separate section of the prison. The rest of the facility was now unreachable. For a moment, there was silence. The alarms had stopped, and the only sounds were the groaning of the damaged structure and the distant hum of failing systems. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He looked around his cell, searching for anything that could help him escape. That's when he noticed the control panel near the entrance. It had been partially crushed by falling debris, exposing wires and circuits beneath. Ethan worked quickly, using a piece of metal from his cot to pry open the panel further. He wasn't an engineer, but he knew enough about electronics to improvise. After a few tense minutes, he managed to disable the barrier. The energy field dissipated with a soft hiss, and Ethan stepped out into the corridor, coughing as dust filled the air. Cale appeared around the corner, his weapon raised. For a split second, Ethan thought the alien might shoot him on sight. Instead, Cale lowered his weapon slightly, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing out of your cell?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "What does it look like?" Ethan shot back, brushing dust off his clothes. "I'm not staying in there to die." Cale hesitated, glancing at the sealed-off section of the corridor behind him. "We're trapped," he said finally. "There's no way out of this section." Ethan crossed his arms. "Great, so we're stuck together?" "It seems so." Kyle's tone was matter-of-fact, but there was a hint of frustration in his voice. "If we want to survive, we'll need to work together." "Work together?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "You've spent months treating me like dirt, and now you expect me to trust you?" "I don't expect anything," Cale replied sharply. But if you want to live, you'll follow my lead. Ethan wanted to argue, but deep down he knew Cale was right. The prison was falling apart around them, and neither of them could make it out alone. Reluctantly, he nodded. Fine. But don't think this means I forgive you. Don't worry, Cale said dryly. I don't forgive you either. With that uneasy agreement, they began exploring their surroundings. The section of the prison they were trapped in was eerily quiet, the usual noise of guards and prisoners replaced by the ominous creaks of a dying structure. Oxygen levels were already dropping, and the temperature was plummeting. Every step felt like a gamble, every corner a potential death trap. As they moved cautiously through the wreckage, Ethan couldn't help but notice how methodical Cale was. The alien scanned every room they entered, checking for hazards and securing loose objects that could become projectiles in zero gravity. Ethan tried to contribute by keeping an eye out for useful items, a flashlight here, a spare oxygen tank there, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Cale still saw him as expendable. Despite their differences, they found themselves relying on each other more than either cared to admit. When a section of the floor gave way beneath Ethan's feet, Cale grabbed him just in time, pulling him back to safety. And when Cale struggled to access a locked storage room, Ethan used his knowledge of hacking to override the security system. Slowly, grudgingly, a fragile partnership began to form. But trust wasn't something that came easily to either of them. Old wounds ran deep, and every small victory was overshadowed by lingering resentment. As they pressed onward, searching for a way out, Ethan couldn't help but wonder, would they survive long enough to put their differences aside? Or would their hatred for each other doom them both? Time was running out, and the prison continued to collapse around them. Ethan and Cale moved through the darkened corridors of the collapsing prison, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The air was growing thinner with each passing minute, and the temperature had dropped to an uncomfortable level. Both men were tense, their eyes darting around for any sign of danger. They hadn't spoken much since their initial argument, but the weight of their situation hung heavy between them. As they turned a corner, they stumbled upon a storage room that had somehow remained intact. The door was slightly ajar, revealing shelves filled with tools, emergency supplies, and a few crates of food. Ethan's face lit up at the sight. This might save us, he muttered, stepping inside to inspect the contents. Cale followed closely behind, his sharp gaze scanning the room for anything useful. On one of the shelves, Ethan found a damaged communication device. It looked old and worn, but it still had some power left. He held it up for Cale to see. Do you think we can fix this? He asked, his voice tinged with hope. Cale took the device from him, examining it carefully. I've worked with similar tech before, he said after a moment. If I can repair it, we might be able to send a distress signal. Ethan nodded, feeling a flicker of optimism for the first time in hours. Good. While you work on that, I'll check the rest of the room for anything else we can use. Cale set to work immediately, pulling out wires and small tools from his belt. His movements were precise and efficient, a stark contrast to Ethan's more chaotic approach as he rummaged through the supplies. Despite their differences, they both understood the importance of staying focused. Every second counted. As Cale tinkered with the device, Ethan discovered a map of the prison tucked inside one of the crates. Unrolling it, he studied the layout carefully. Hey, look at this, he said, holding the map up for Cale to see. There's an escape pod bay on the other side of the station. If we can get there, we might have a chance. Kyle glanced at the map briefly before returning his attention to the communicator. It's risky, he said. We don't know if the pods are still functional or if the path is clear. But it's better than staying here. Ethan folded the map and tucked it into his pocket. Then we'll make it work. We don't have a choice. The two continued their search, gathering whatever they could carry. Ethan found a length of rope, a flashlight, and a small toolkit, while Cale located a portable oxygen tank and a thermal blanket. By the time they finished, the communicator was partially repaired, though it still needed more work. We should keep moving, Cale said, standing up. Staying in one place for too long is dangerous. Ethan agreed, and they left the storage room, heading deeper into the wreckage. The journey was fraught with challenges. Gravity shifted unpredictably, sometimes pulling them toward the floor, and other times sending them floating helplessly into the air. Loose debris floated everywhere, making navigation difficult. At one point, a section of the ceiling collapsed ahead of them, forcing them to find a detour. Despite the obstacles, Ethan and Cale began to rely on each other more. When Ethan struggled to climb over a pile of rubble, Cale offered him a hand, steadying him until he regained his footing. And when Cale's sensitive hearing picked up the faint sound of groaning metal, Ethan warned him to move quickly, avoiding a falling beam that nearly crushed them both. Their interactions remained terse, but there were moments of unspoken understanding. Cale appreciated Ethan's quick thinking, especially when he used the rope to secure a wobbly walkway, preventing it from collapsing under their weight. Ethan, in turn, respected Cale's calm demeanor during moments of crisis, even if he didn't say so aloud. As they pressed onward, they encountered another survivor, a desperate inmate named Marcus. His clothes were torn, and his face was streaked with dirt and sweat. When he saw Ethan and Cale, his eyes widened with fear. "Please, I need help," he pleaded, holding up his hands defensively. "I'm not armed. I just want to survive." Ethan instinctively reached for the makeshift weapon he had fashioned earlier, but Cale raised a hand to stop him. "Wait," he said firmly. "He's unarmed. Let's hear him out." Marcus explained that he had been hiding in a maintenance tunnel when the asteroid storm hit. He had managed to avoid the worst of the destruction, but now he was lost and running out of air. "I swear I won't cause trouble," he insisted. "Just let me come with you." Ethan hesitated, distrustful of the stranger. "We don't have enough supplies for 3 people," he argued. "And how do we know he's telling the truth?" Cale frowned, considering the situation. "We can't leave him here to die," he said finally. "If we're going to survive, we need to stick together." Reluctantly, Ethan backed down, though he wasn't happy about it. Marcus joined them, keeping close to Cale as they resumed their journey. For a while, things seemed to go smoothly. Marcus proved helpful, pointing out hazards and assisting with tasks like carrying supplies. But tensions simmered beneath the surface, especially between Ethan and Marcus, who exchanged wary glances whenever Cale wasn't looking. The group eventually reached a large chamber that served as a junction point for several corridors. It was cluttered with debris and the walls were cracked, leaking toxic gas into the air. Cale pulled out the portable oxygen tank and handed it to Ethan. "Use this sparingly," he instructed. "We don't know how long it will last." They tried to navigate the treacherous area. Marcus suddenly lunged forward, grabbing the oxygen tank from Ethan's hands. "I need this more than you," he shouted, his voice wild with panic. Before anyone could react, he bolted down one of the corridors, disappearing into the shadows. Ethan cursed under his breath, ready to chase after him, but Cale stopped him. "Let him go," he said firmly. "He's not worth the risk." "But he took our only oxygen tank," Ethan protested, frustration boiling over. "How are we supposed to survive without it?" Cale's expression was grim. "We'll figure something out," he said. "But chasing him into unknown territory is a bad idea. Focus on what we can control." Ethan clenched his fists, anger and fear battling inside him. He wanted to argue, but deep down he knew Cale was right. They couldn't afford to waste energy on someone who clearly didn't care about teamwork or survival. As they regrouped and planned their next move, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their alliance was hanging by a thread. Trust was fragile, and every decision felt like a gamble. Yet despite everything, he found himself relying on Cale more and more. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance, if they could hold it together long enough to reach safety. Ethan and Cale pressed on, their steps heavy with exhaustion. The toxic gas had begun to dissipate, but the air was still thin and hard to breathe. Both men moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the wreckage for any sign of danger. The tension between them lingered, though neither spoke about Marcus or the stolen oxygen tank. They focused instead on survival, one step at a time. As they navigated through the ruins, they came across a small security office. The door was partially open, its lock broken from the earlier chaos, Inside, the room was cluttered with overturned chairs and scattered papers. A flickering monitor on the wall caught Ethan's attention. He approached it, brushing dust off the screen as he tried to make sense of what he saw. "What are you doing?" Cale asked, standing in the doorway and keeping watch. "Looking for answers," Ethan replied. He tapped a few keys on the keyboard, and the monitor lit up with files and logs. Most of them were corrupted, but some were still intact. Ethan scrolled through them, his brow furrowing as he read. "This place, it wasn't just a prison," he said after a moment. "They were running experiments here. Illegal ones." Cale stepped closer, peering over Ethan's shoulder. "What kind of experiments?" Ethan hesitated, scrolling further. "On prisoners," he said finally. "Testing chemicals, biological agents, stuff that could kill people, and they didn't care if they survived or not." Cale's expression darkened. "I've heard rumors about places like this," he admitted. "Facilities where governments test weapons or drugs on those who can't fight back. I never thought I'd see proof of it." Ethan turned to face him, anger flashing in his eyes. "And you worked here? You knew this was happening?" Cale shook his head firmly. "No, I was assigned here as punishment. My people don't approve of such practices. When I spoke out against corruption in my own government, they sent me here to silence me." Ethan stared at him, unsure whether to believe him. "You're telling me you're some kind of rebel?" "I'm telling you I'm not proud of what I've done," Cale said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "But I didn't know about this. If I had, I would have tried to stop it." The two men fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling between them. Ethan returned his attention to the monitor, digging deeper into the files. As he sifted through the data, he stumbled upon something unexpected: records of his own imprisonment. His hands trembled as he read the details. It wasn't just smuggling charges, they had fabricated evidence against him. Someone high up had wanted him silenced. "You okay?" Kyle asked, noticing Ethan's reaction. "They set me up," Ethan muttered, his voice tight with emotion. "I was delivering medical supplies to colonies in need, people who couldn't afford help. But someone in power didn't like that. They framed me to shut me down." Kyle studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It seems we're not so different after all," he said quietly. "Both used as pawns by systems we couldn't fight." For the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of understanding toward Cale. Maybe the alien wasn't just another cog in the machine. Maybe he had been trapped, just like Ethan. Their moment of reflection was interrupted by a loud crash outside. The walls shook and dust rained down from the ceiling. "We need to keep moving," Kyle said urgently. "This place won't hold much longer." They left the security office and continued their journey, sticking close to each other as they navigated the unstable corridors. Along the way, they found remnants of the experiments Ethan had uncovered: sealed containers labeled with warnings, shattered glass vials leaking strange substances, and even a few bodies that hadn't been recovered. The sight chilled them, both reinforcing the horror of what had happened there. Hours passed, and the path grew more treacherous. Gravity fluctuated wildly, sometimes pulling them toward the floor and other times sending them floating into the air. At one point, they reached a section of the corridor blocked by a massive beam. Kyle examined it closely, tapping the metal with his weapon. "This is structural support," he said. "If we try to move it, the whole area could collapse." Ethan frowned, looking around for alternatives. There has to be another way through. After a few minutes of searching, they discovered a narrow maintenance tunnel above them. It was barely wide enough for one person to crawl through, but it seemed stable enough. "I'll go first," Ethan volunteered, hoisting himself up onto the ledge. "No," Cale said firmly. "Let me. If it gives way, I'm stronger. I can handle it better." Ethan wanted to argue, but he knew Cale was right. Reluctantly, he stepped back, letting the alien take the lead. Cale climbed into the tunnel, moving slowly and carefully. Ethan followed close behind, the sound of groaning metal echoing around them. Halfway through, the tunnel began to shift. A loud creak filled the air, and Ethan froze, his heart pounding. "Kyle," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Keep moving," Kyle urged, his tone calm but urgent. "Don't stop." They crawled faster, the tunnel shaking violently beneath them. Just as they reached the end, the structure collapsed behind them, sealing off the passage they had come through. Ethan tumbled out onto the floor, gasping for air. Cale landed beside him, his scales glinting faintly in the dim light. "That was too close," Ethan said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Cale nodded, his expression grim. "We're running out of time. If we don't find a way out soon, we won't make it." Despite the near-death experience, the two men felt a newfound sense of unity. They had shared secrets, faced dangers together, and survived when others might have given up. For the first time, Ethan realized that Cale wasn't just an alien guard. He was a person, flawed and complex, just like him. As they stood up and prepared to continue, Ethan glanced at Cale. "Thanks," he said simply. "For back there." Cale met his gaze, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "You would have done the same," he replied. Ethan didn't respond, but he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could trust each other enough to make it out alive. Ethan and Cale moved forward, their steps slower now but more determined. The prison was falling apart around them, its groans and creaks growing louder with each passing moment. They had been through so much already: collapses, toxic gas, narrow escapes, but the worst was yet to come. Every step felt heavier, every decision more critical. Time was running out, and they both knew it. They reached a large chamber that served as a hub for several corridors. In the center of the room stood a massive console, its screens flickering with static. Kyle approached it cautiously, his sharp eyes scanning the controls. "This might be important," he said, tapping a few buttons. The console came to life, displaying a map of the remaining sections of the prison. One area stood out, a cluster of escape pods located on the far side of the facility. Ethan leaned over to look at the map. "That's our way out," he said, pointing to the pod bay. "If we can get there, we might have a chance." Cale nodded, but his expression remained grim. "It won't be easy. The path is unstable, and we don't know how many pods are still functional." "We don't have a choice," Ethan replied firmly. "We either try or die here." With that, they set off again, following the map's guidance through the labyrinth of wreckage. The journey was grueling. Gravity shifted unpredictably, sometimes pulling them toward the floor and other times sending them floating into the air. Loose debris floated everywhere, forcing them to dodge falling beams and jagged metal shards. At one point, they had to cross a long, narrow bridge that had partially collapsed. Kyle went first, testing each step carefully before signaling for Ethan to follow. The tension was palpable, but they made it across without incident. As they neared the escape pod bay, they encountered another survivor. It was Marcus, the desperate inmate who had stolen their oxygen tank earlier. He was slumped against a wall, his face pale and his breathing shallow. When he saw them, his eyes widened with fear. "Please don't leave me," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Ethan hesitated, anger flashing in his eyes. "You took our oxygen, you left us to die." "I didn't mean to," Marcus pleaded, his voice trembling. "I panicked. I thought I could make it on my own, but I was wrong. I'm sorry." Kyle stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "He doesn't have much time," he said quietly. "Without help, he'll die here." Ethan clenched his fists, torn between his anger and his sense of morality. "We don't have enough supplies for 3 people, he argued. "And how do we know he won't betray us again?" Kyle looked at Ethan, his gaze steady. "We can't save everyone, but if we turn our backs on him now, what does that say? About us, about who we are?" Ethan stared at Cale, frustration warring with guilt. Finally, he sighed and nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But if he slows us down, we leave him behind." Cale helped Marcus to his feet, supporting him as they continued toward the escape pod bay. Marcus apologized repeatedly, his voice weak but sincere. Ethan ignored him, focusing instead on the path ahead. Every step felt like a gamble, every corner a potential death trap. When they finally reached the pod bay, their hearts sank. Only one pod remained intact, its hatch sealed tightly. Cale examined it closely, running diagnostics to check its condition. "It's functional," he announced after a moment. "But it's only built for two." The group fell silent, the weight of the situation settling over them. Marcus looked at Ethan and Cale, his face filled with despair. "Go," he said softly. "Leave me. I've caused enough trouble." "No," Cale said firmly. "We're not leaving anyone behind." Ethan frowned, stepping closer to Cale. "What are you talking about? There's no room for all of us." Cale met his gaze, his expression resolute. "There's room for you and Marcus. I'll stay behind." "What?" Ethan exclaimed, his voice rising. "You can't do that. We need you." "You don't," Cale replied calmly. "You've proven you can survive without me. Marcus needs medical attention, and you need someone to help you operate the pod. I'll stay here and manually override the launch sequence." Ethan shook his head, panic rising in his chest. "No, we'll find another way." "There isn't one," Kyle said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "This is the only chance you have. Trust me." For a moment, Ethan was speechless. He looked at Cale, seeing not just an alien guard but a person who had risked everything to keep them alive. Slowly he nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Cale gave him a small, faint smile. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." With that, Cale turned to the control panel, his hands moving quickly as he worked to override the launch sequence. Ethan and Marcus climbed into the pod, strapping themselves in. As the hatch sealed shut, Ethan looked out the window, watching Cale through the glass. The alien gave him a final nod, then turned back to the controls. The pod launched with a jolt, propelling them away from the collapsing prison. Ethan watched through the window as the station crumbled behind them, consumed by fire and debris. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered a quiet goodbye to the alien who had saved his life. Hours later, the pod was picked up by a passing freighter. Ethan and Marcus were taken aboard, where medical teams tended to their injuries. Marcus recovered slowly, his guilt and gratitude evident in every word he spoke. Ethan, however, was quieter. He spent hours staring out the ship's windows, lost in thought. When they finally reached civilization, Ethan stepped off the freighter and onto solid ground for the first time in days. The fresh air felt strange, almost overwhelming. He knew his life would never be the same. The experience had changed him, forced him to confront things he had long ignored. Standing on the dock, Ethan looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, among the endless expanse of space, was Cale, or what remained of him. Ethan vowed silently to honor the alien sacrifice, to fight for justice and understanding between humans and aliens. It wouldn't bring Cale back, but it was the least he could do. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Ethan was ready. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. And as he walked away from the dock, he carried with him the memory of an unlikely ally who had shown him the true meaning of courage and sacrifice. Ethan stood on the edge of a crowded plaza, the noise of the city buzzing around him. People hurried past, their faces buried in their devices or focused on their destinations. None of them seemed to notice the man standing quietly near the fountain, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Ethan had been back for weeks now, but he still felt like an outsider, disconnected from the world he once knew. The experience in the collapsing prison had left its mark on him. He couldn't shake the memories, the explosions, the toxic air, the desperate struggle to survive. But most of all, he thought about Cale, the alien guard who had been his enemy, then his ally, and finally his savior. Every night, Ethan dreamed of the moment the escape pod launched, leaving Cale behind in the ruins of the station. He woke up with a heavy heart, the weight of gratitude and loss pressing down on him. Determined to honor Cale's sacrifice, Ethan began advocating for change. He started small, speaking at local meetings about the injustices he had witnessed in the prison. At first, few people listened. They dismissed him as a troublemaker, a former prisoner with an axe to grind. But Ethan didn't give up. He gathered evidence from the files he had uncovered during their escape, piecing together a case that exposed the illegal experiments and corruption within the system. It wasn't easy. There were days when Ethan wanted to quit, when the resistance he faced felt overwhelming. But he remembered Cale's calm determination, his willingness to stand up for what was right even when it cost him everything. That memory kept Ethan going, pushing him to fight harder. Slowly, his efforts began to gain traction. Journalists took notice of his story, writing articles that brought attention to the horrors hidden within facilities like the one where he had been held. Activists joined his cause, organizing protests and demanding investigations into the treatment of prisoners across the galaxy. Ethan became a voice for those who had none, using his platform to shine a light on the dark corners of the system. One evening, after a long day of meetings and interviews, Ethan found himself standing in front of a memorial dedicated to victims of space disasters. The monument was simple, a curved wall etched with names and dates, but it carried a profound sense of loss. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of Cale's armor, salvaged from the wreckage of the prison. It was all he had left of the alien who had saved his life. He placed the fragment gently on the base of the monument, his hands trembling slightly. "This is for you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "I won't forget what you did, and I'll make sure no one else does either." Tears welled up in his eyes as he thought about everything they had endured together. Their journey had been marked by mistrust and conflict, but it had also been a testament to the power of unity and understanding. In the end, Cale had shown him that enemies could become allies, and strangers could become friends. That lesson stayed with Ethan, shaping the way he approached the world. As he turned to leave, a young woman approached him, her expression curious. "Are you Ethan Cole?" she asked hesitantly. Ethan nodded, surprised. "Yes. Why?" "I read your story," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "What happened to you? It made me realize how much work we still have to do. I want to help. Can I join your cause?" Ethan smiled faintly, feeling a flicker of hope. "Of course," he replied. "We can always use more voices." Together they walked away from the monument, heading toward the heart of the city. Ethan knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. Change never came easily, especially when it challenged deeply rooted systems of power. But he was ready. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, he looked out the window at the stars. Somewhere out there, among the endless expanse of space, was Cale, or what remained of him. Ethan didn't know if Cale had believed in a higher purpose or if he had simply acted out of duty. But he knew one thing for certain. Cale had changed him. He had taught him the value of trust, compassion, and sacrifice. In the silence of his room, Ethan made a quiet vow. He would dedicate his life to bridging the gap between humans and aliens, to building a future where such sacrifices weren't necessary. It wouldn't bring Kyle back, but it was the least he could do. And as he closed his eyes, he allowed himself to imagine a world where differences didn't divide people but instead brought them closer together. The next morning, Ethan woke up with renewed energy. He met with activists, spoke at rallies, and worked tirelessly to push for reforms. His message resonated with many, sparking conversations about justice and equality, not just on Earth but across the galaxy. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Years passed, and Ethan's efforts bore fruit. New laws were enacted to protect prisoners' rights, and investigations exposed corruption at the highest levels of government. Memorials were built to honor those who had suffered in silence, ensuring their stories would never be forgotten. Ethan became a symbol of resilience and hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, change was possible. But through it all, he never forgot Cale. On quiet nights when the world felt too big and the challenges too great, Ethan would look up at the stars and whisper a silent thank you. He didn't know if Cale could hear him, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the legacy they had created together. A legacy of courage, unity, and the belief that even enemies could find common ground when faced with the impossible. And so Ethan continued his journey, carrying Cale's memory with him every step of the way. The stars above seemed brighter now, hinting at untold possibilities for the future. Somewhere out there, among the vastness of space, was a chance for understanding, for connection, for peace. And Ethan was determined to seize it, for himself, for Cale, and for everyone who had ever dared to hope.